Well, key points in the Easter story 2,000 years ago were set within a garden, and it therefore just seemed appropriate this morning to set this talk in the context of a garden. The government tell us that the coronavirus epidemic, at least within the UK, is going to peak this weekend, or at least in the week or two following. But in a very, very different sense, of course. This is the culmination within the Christian calendar, a high point in a sense. If now can be described as peak virus, then Easter Day is very much peak hope for Christians. And the passage that we have heard this morning describes that moment where despair turns to hope, but that hope was not immediately evident to those early Christian disciples. And John uses those words, while it was still dark. While it was still dark. In one sense, of course, he's just describing the obvious. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb before dawn. But somehow those words also capture the despair and the emotion, the mood that Jesus' disciples must have felt. Their leader had turned their world upside down over the last 3 years of his ministry. He changed their understanding of what God the Father was really like wherever he'd gone. There had been his teaching and his miracles had brought life and hope. And of course he'd engaged not only with the wealthy and the important in that society, but also those on the bottom rung of the ladder, and again brought transformation and change. And now he was gone. He'd upset too many people, particularly amongst the religious elite, and they had pressed Pilate, the Roman governor, to have him executed, and that appeared to be the end. So those same followers must have been asking themselves, what was the last 3 years all about? They were in a dark place. They themselves had deserted Jesus at the end, and there must have been a real sense of shame and loss that they felt from that. So those words, while it was still dark, captures something of this mood. But things, of course, were about to dramatically change. Nothing was going to be the same again. When Mary Magdalene arrives at the tomb, she sees the stone rolled away. I think the notion that that this was a turning point almost in human history would have been not even on her furthest horizon. If anything, her despair would have deepened, because it looked as though the body had been stolen overnight. And when Peter and John arrived and Peter goes inside, he sees the grave clothes, they probably came to, in their own minds, the same conclusion. And we're told in this passage that they go home. But Mary doesn't go home. We're told that she turns and sees Jesus, but for whatever reason, she doesn't recognize him. Just put yourself in her place for one moment. The person that you love more than anyone else has suffered the most humiliating and agonizing death. You are full of despair and confusion. And then in one word, it changes. Jesus speaks her name, Mary, Mary. And in that moment, she recognizes. Can you imagine how she must have felt? Her despair and grief would have been turned to joy. Her despair must have been replaced with an unparalleled sense of hope. I think all of us get the fact that at the level of our individual lives, actually life isn't straightforward, it's not predictable, even though at times we live our lives as though life was predictable. We make our plans and priorities as though everything's buttoned down over the next few years. We know it's not actually like that, that things happen. But I think in talking with many recently, all of us have been unsettled by the sheer scale of what's happened and of course the far-reaching consequences. I mean, of course, those who are older and unwell anyway are more vulnerable, but it's not just those who are being struck down, younger people as well. And aside from the daily loss of life, there's the immense unseen costs, jobs, businesses, livelihoods, families, perhaps critical illnesses delayed within hospitals because of what is of the focus on the COVID virus. And of course children and adults shut up in homes with their abusers. All these things will bit by bit come out in the months and the years ahead. If Easter really is a moment of hope, what can it possibly say in this context? I think all of us feel the most immense thankfulness and admiration for NHS staff, and particularly those who are dealing directly with patients in the COVID virus wards. They are very much in the thick of it. And at the heart of the Easter story is the person of Jesus Christ, who in his society over those 3 years was very much in the thick of the problems. He was there encountering and engaging with the oppression, the injustice, the poverty, the suffering. And his life, death and resurrection point to a God who isn't on the margins of our lives, but actually wants to be walking with us, accompanying us, who himself has experienced suffering and hardship, who isn't a God that can only be approached with the right religious language, but actually wants us just to be real, who we are, express in the simplest words how we are feeling. I think secondly, because of what happened on that Easter morning, countless millions of Christians across the world today, including many in our own community, have found a strength and a comfort in their faith in Jesus Christ as their companion, their friend, as well as their Lord and Saviour, not in some sort of ethereal, feel-good, transient way, here today, gone tomorrow, but in a more substantial way, in a way which gives them strength and joy, a compass for life, and a hope which transcends whatever it is that life throws at them, even ultimately death itself. Today our church buildings may be empty, but the empty tomb in our reading today ultimately points us to a God who promises a fullness of life with him now and forever. And thirdly, we can have confidence because it's true. The very fact the Bible goes out of its way to emphasise the sheer frailty of those early disciples, their tentativeness, their incomprehension at what is going on here, makes it even more remarkable that those same people ultimately over the years ahead experienced huge persecution. We know that from other historical sources, and almost certainly themselves suffered execution for their faith at the end. Why would they do that if it was all a fabrication? They must have been convinced that Jesus Christ really did rise and was alive and was with them. So this morning, in the midst of what for all of us is a genuinely difficult and unsettling time, the Easter story points us to a God who understands, who walks with us, who strengthens us, who invites us to seek him in those dark places we might find ourselves in, and also to reflect again on the hope that our faith represents and means to us in the resurrection story that we celebrate today. Maybe just in a minute or two you would want to just pause and think about what that hope means to you personally and for those that you love in the context that you are in now.